In the Invincible Universe, there are many monsters running amok. A man named after the concept of Conquest itself. A man bred to be the ultimate warrior of the supreme alien race in all of the cosmos. And even a Doomsday-like being that evolves to match and adapt to whatever can manage to critically injure him. But there's one character who's overcome all of these beings. Spoiler warning ahead, but this is the final emperor of the Viltrumites, Mark Grayson. Throughout the story, we'd see Mark in his young adult years be tested by the universe itself, with many brutal and close battles against the strongest it's had to offer, while being placed in dilemmas that would require every ounce of his mental and emotional capacity, and somehow manage to come out on top each time. After inheriting the mantle of king from his father Nolan Grayson, and doing some cleanup on Earth, Mark would take the Viltrumite race and relocate himself across the galaxy in order to lead it and use their power to bring peace to the entire universe over the course of 500 years. In this video, we'll be going over the character and feats of Mark Grayson in order to try and find out just how strong Mark truly becomes at the end of the story. With that said, any engagement you provide to the channel will really help it out and let me know to continue making content such as this, so anything's appreciated. I'll cut the intro here and get straight into the video. As the half-human, half-Viltrumite son of Nolan the Great and the grandson of Emperor Argol, Invincible was always bound to grow into a combatant who'd become a cut above the rest of the Viltrumite race, as it was believed that their bloodline was so pure that they were above the average Viltrumite. We see this come into play as Mark was able to survive some of the worst beatdowns against some of the most powerful opponents and always come out on top at the age of 17. I find this important to mention because if there was any reason why Mark does come out on top of a lot of his fights, despite being way younger and inexperienced than most of his opponents, it's most likely this, and of course the fact that he does receive some help here and there. This allows me to say, for a race that seems to get more powerful the more they age, it's extremely impressive that Mark was so young and yet able to throw hands with some of the best. Keep in mind, the 500-year-old Emperor Invincible we see at the end of the story will live to be at least double or even quadruple that age, more than likely becoming even more powerful than he already is. Well, enough of giving background to Mark, let's get into the stats per usual. To begin with his physical strength, Mark is the character we follow throughout the series, so of course he's gonna have a lot of crazy demonstrations of power. Mark has put off some pretty cool feats such as comboing Conquest all the way to space in a few blows, matching Omni-Man in a serious arm wrestle but throwing it because of Anisha showing up and not wanting to embarrass his father in front of his subjects, and this is the same Omni-Man who is slicing and dicing Thrag's children in half with his bare hands. These same children of Thrags being able to fly through massive imploding alien ships with no damage sustained. That's the same person that Mark is forfeiting arm wrestling matches against out of pity. Most people consider Omni-Man and Conquest to be extremely close in strength, so I'll reference the moment that Conquest casually broke out of a 400-ton solid steel case that was encasing his entire body and left Earth. Keep in mind, these are all feats I'm mentioning before Eve would give Mark a power boost after healing him from Thrag ripping him in half. After this unquantified power boost, we see that Mark is actually able to match up to Thrag in the final battle. You may say that Mark was a little bit weaker than Thrag here, but Mark holding his own against Thrag is still a massive improvement. You gotta remember how Mark versus Thrag always went before the final battle in the series. Not only this, but every time Mark would fight Robot in that black suit, he would have a very hard time just keeping up. But after his final boost and the battle against Thrag, he's easily able to impale Robot and just goes on about his life. This tells me that the boost Eve provided Mark was pretty big and shoots him all the way up to the second strongest Viltrumite, or maybe even first depending on how you interpret the final battle with him and Thrag. And add the extra 500 years where he's able to fight against Alan and actually win. I genuinely think that Mark has at least top 3 physical strength in the series. I mean, hurting Thrag and Alan is proof enough. We wouldn't even need to do any calculations or anything like that, as hurting those two characters is unheard of. As a Viltrumite, Mark's durability is going to be even more impressive than his already insane strength. First and foremost, Viltrumites' bodies are made out of smart atoms, which allows them to survive extremely harsh conditions for a prolonged period of time. That's how Mark was able to fight in the sun for a bit. But that setting was hot enough to showcase the limits of these smart atoms, as Mark would barely make it out alive. Aside from smart atoms allowing Mark to withstand all sorts of conditions, he can also no-sell a lot of insanely destructive attacks. For example, this nuke that Mark would tank head-on has been calculated to emit a fireball the size of the moon. We can use America below the fireball to estimate the size of the explosion. Mark would be knocked out by this for a bit, but he just woke up with no visible damage and flew back down to Earth. He would also withstand an explosion that would vaporize an entire city and come out with no visible damage. I mean, even go back to the battle against Thrag. They're both withstanding not only the surface of the sun, but the constant solar flares. Solar flares are stated to erupt at speeds upwards of millions of miles per hour, while boasting the force of 1,000 modern day nukes bare minimum. That may be an outlier, but it's still in Mark's bag. On top of Mark eating nukes for breakfast, exchanging blows with many of the characters in the cast is noteworthy, as he's taken some serious, and I mean cringe-worthy beatings from aliens who conquer entire planets as easily as they breathe. We can only assume that Mark's ability to take a beating has improved since, by now, he may just be. Now thankfully, Mark has tons and tons of speed feats that place him far above the speed of light. Mark late into the series is able to move across the galaxy so fast that the stars around him are blurred out. Remember, galaxies are typically the size of many light years. This already places him at above the speed of light. But to only reinforce the speed of Mark, very early into the series we see Alan punch Mark all the way to Earth, and Mark is able to react by flying right back up and slamming Alan into the moon in the span of what seems to be a few seconds. Even in his first fight against Conquest, they were moving so fast that the shockwaves from their speed were tearing people apart. Lastly, Mark was able to fight against Thrag as a young adult, the same Thrag who Space Racer could not keep up with in terms of speed. And this is the same Space Racer who was able to track and follow a Viltrumite through an entire solar system in the span of what seems to be a couple of days at most. There was even a moment where Thrag's twin children were flying toward Mark while he was holding his child, and he moved out of the way so fast that they slammed into each other. I can rave about Mark's speed all day, but you get the point. I personally don't think Mark's speed has increased the same way his strength and durability may have over the span of 500 years, but it's certainly possible. It's just that he's already beyond the speed of light. What more does he need? Now, to briefly cover Mark's intelligence, it's kind of hard to get a decent gauge on it as he's shown some pretty clever strategies to handle his vast array of opponents in the series, and he's made a lot of decisions on the spot that does show me that he's very good at processing information. But he also has this tendency to jump into fights without really assessing the situation or his current opponent, especially if he's frustrated. I would say that Mark is someone who's really intelligent when it comes to battle and can usually find some kind of way to overcome an extremely powerful opponent. But he's not really that smart when it comes to decision making, but that's also not what really matters here. We're focusing on his intelligence when he's in a fight, and he's pretty smart when it comes to that. Now, to quickly cover any extra abilities that Mark possesses, he has an above average healing factor but nothing insane. Mark has taken some serious injuries and survived them, yes, but he typically requires a lot of time and medical attention to heal his injuries. Despite this, his healing factor is strong enough to allow him to regenerate from almost anything as long as his organs aren't damaged. Mark also has very strong mental resilience as he was able to beat out a parasite that was attempting to hijack his brain alone, with Brit giving him the edge over the parasite. Keep in mind, nobody else was able to resist except for him. One last thing about Mark is that he possesses extraordinary willpower. He's able to push through any sort of pain he may face, especially if motivated. Mark also has many weaknesses that tend to be the reason why he has a hard time with a lot of his fights as well. For example, all Viltrumites are extremely weak to a certain frequency that isn't extremely loud or anything crazy. It's just a very specific frequency that messes with the equilibrium of a Viltrumite only. This frequency has been used against Mark many times over, and I think it may still be pretty effective on him even after centuries of growth, but who knows. He was able to fight through it in a much weaker state, so I doubt it, but I thought it was still worth mentioning. Another weakness that he and all Viltrumites have are like humans. If you target their heart, their healing factor will be severely cut and they'll most likely die. Except for that, there's really no notable weaknesses that Mark has. You could say that he still probably holds back a lot, but as strong as he's become by the end of the series, none of these weaknesses make much of a difference. However, I still mention them here because I am not the writer of Invincible. I am not the person who confirms whether or not these weaknesses are still present at the end of the story. All in all, Mark by the end of Invincible is one of the fastest and most powerful characters who can withstand pretty much anything that any other character can, while having unparalleled drive, especially if he has to protect the people that he loves. I think that's quite clear. But like all videos, I'm going to cover a few fights that allow me to reinforce Mark's greatest strengths. To begin, I think it's best to start with his rematch against Conquest. Many people like to bring up the fact that Mark had help in his first fight, so he wasn't close to Conquest's strength halfway through the series. But their rematch takes place in issue 72, 8 issues after their first fight would conclude, so much hasn't happened in between, and we can assume Mark to be at most a little bit above his power level from when he fought Conquest the first time. In this rematch, Conquest attacks Nolan first, causing Mark to tackle Conquest and start drawing blood with a few hits. Conquest punches Mark off of him and chooses to chase Oliver, who is flying to a nearby planet to get some oxygen. And this causes Mark to panic and follow Conquest to the planet, resulting in Mark tackling Conquest and slamming him into the planet. When they get out of the wreckage, we see that Mark is choking out Conquest, and this is where a majority of the struggle begins. As Mark attempts to eliminate Conquest this way, Conquest struggles relentlessly, even punching a hole through Mark's stomach, but even then, it wasn't enough. Their struggle becomes so chaotic that it results in Mark dragging Conquest all throughout the planet, and even creating a massive crater that contains both Mark and Conquest passed out. Conquest actually dies for good here, whereas Mark was going to die too, but Nolan finds him, bandages him up, and takes care of him while he's in an extremely long coma. I covered this fight to let people know that Mark was already nearing the level of the most powerful Viltrumites about 65% into the story, and he only gets more powerful from there. Another moment I want to bring up that's pretty important yet goofy is Mark's arm wrestle with his father in issue 106. Now this all started because Eve and Mark went to have dinner with his parents, and Eve does not like his father because of what he's done to Mark all the way when they first fought. Now, they're sitting at the table and Nolan's like, "I know you don't like me, Eve, but I never do anything like that again." And Mark's like, "Yeah, even if he tried, I'd whoop him this time around." Now this causes the two to size up each other a bit, and then it cuts to them in an arm wrestling match. This arm wrestling match is extremely close, but it comes to a conclusion with Nolan winning the moment that Mark sees Anissa pulling up to the ship. Mark wasn't scared of her or anything like that, but he goes on to ask his dad if the Viltrumite Empire decides their leader based on strength, and his dad's like, "Nah, it doesn't." This moment specifically implies that Mark as a young adult is at least equal to or above Omni-Man in strength by issue 106, as Mark made it kind of clear that he threw the match to preserve his father's pride. Now, we have the final battle of the young adult Mark against Thrag. This battle begins after Thrag manages to rip Nolan in half and incapacitate him. Mark takes over and the two combatants go blow for blow almost the entire fight. But Mark reaches his breaking point when Thrag begins to throw his own children at him as if they were impact grenades. And he declares that he refuses to allow Thrag to kill any more of his own children. Mark then tackles him onto the surface of a star, and the two go blow for an extended amount of time, resulting in Mark grabbing Thrag once more as he tried to retreat and diving the both of them into the star itself, completely burning their skin off. The two go blow for blow once more, but this time they're at the brink of death. But there's something Mark had that Thrag did not, something that can push Mark beyond the prospect of death and allow him to fight beyond it: love. This drives Mark to eventually overcome Thrag in this war of attrition, but he collapses soon after and is rescued by Alan. Here, Mark actually managed to defeat Thrag in a one-on-one here, but it also should be noted that Robot did give Mark a suit that let him last a bit longer in the star than he should have. Despite this, Mark's performance is stunning in every way possible, as you can no longer deny that he rivals the strongest characters at that point of the story. Last is another brief moment, but we see that Mark and Alan fight 500 years into the future in the final issue of the series, with Mark coming out on top relatively unscathed. Now if you remember, Alan was very powerful after his Zenkai boost. He was able to absolutely ragdoll Omni-Man when they fight over the Scourge virus. If we assume that Alan has gotten any more powerful over the 500-year time skip, Mark defeating him is very impressive. I also want to include that Mark and Alan didn't really seem to take too much damage here. It's more like Alan just got overpowered. From my perspective, this was closer to a spar than an actual deathmatch, as the two are still friends despite them being at war. And they were only at war because Alan was taking a capitalist approach to peace over the galaxy and all that when it wasn't necessary anymore, and Mark just wanted to abolish that and protect every planet for free. There wasn't really much to have a serious fight over, it was just a clash of ideologies between friends. Emperor Invincible is a man who's faced pretty much every character in the top 10 of the series at least once, been through a roller coaster of hell, and still manages to come out on top of it all, a happy man with a great family, an empire of Viltrumites to rule, and the man who managed to change everything. If I had to say, Emperor Invincible may just be the most powerful character in the story of Invincible, and rightfully so, as he has managed to defeat every contender for this title except for Battle Beast, who I'm sure he'd humble after the 500-year time skip. Mark sits on the throne as top 1 easily. If you enjoyed the video, thank you so much for watching, as I appreciate all of your support as usual, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace out.